Hello, my name is Ulrike Ziegler and I'm an art historian with a special interest in medieval and Renaissance art in the German-speaking countries. I'm also a lecturer for art pursuits abroad, and this job gives me a wonderful opportunity to visit the places associated with my special fields of interest. Today I want to talk to you about a region that is most interesting, and that is Tyrol, or as it was called in the Middle Ages, the land in the mountains. Ever since the end of World War I in 1918, the former territory of Tyrol is partitioned into northern Austrian Tyrol and Italian South Tyrol, with the border running across the Brenner Pass. And when we look back into Roman times, 2000 years back, all of Tyrol was part of the Roman Empire. And with the decline and downfall of the Roman Empire, this territory was invaded by various Germanic tribes. One were the Lombards, who settled in larger parts of South Tyrol all the way towards Bolzano, and from the north it were the Bavarians who invaded Tyrolean territory. And both people eventually are conquered by Charlemagne in the 8th century, and the Lombard kingdom as well as the Duchy of Bavaria are incorporated into the Frankish Empire. Now, beginning with Charlemagne, who went to Rome to be anointed emperor the first time after the decline of the Western Roman Empire, the passage through the Alps, coming from the north towards Italy in the south, became vital for these rulers. To make sure that their passage is unhindered in the future, various Frankish rulers and then eventually Holy Roman emperors unhinged counties in this area of modern-day Tyrol and fiefed these territories to the prince-bishops of Trento, Trient, and Bressanone, Brixen. The idea was that these bishops are closely affiliated with the rulers and would secure a free passage through the mountains across the Brenner Pass. Unfortunately, these prince bishops needed bailiffs to exercise secular power, and these duties, these positions of bailiffs, again were enfeoffed by these prince bishops to local counts. And when you look onto slide 2, you can see how Tyrol is made up in the Middle Ages from the territory mentioned, from the north, from Innsbruck, northern Tyrol, all the way down into what is even modern-day Trentino. The most important counts in this area were the counts of Tyrol. They are named after their eponymous castle just above Merano, as you can see here on slide 2, and a second family, the Counts of Andix, who had possessions in the Inn Valley north of the Alps and who were the founders of Innsbruck. Now, by and by, through marriage, through inheritance, or simply bloody feuds, these comital families managed to withdraw power from their prince-episcopal overlords and become powerful in their own rights. And when you see the birth of the county of Tyrol in 1248, respectively 1254, there are 2 steps stretching over these 2 years. What happened at that time is that the Counts of Tyrol had finally managed, through 2 very advantageous marriages, to acquire almost the complete territory you see on this map marked in red. The yellow territories are the ones belonging to the prince bishops of Trent and Bressanone. So in the mid-13th century, we finally have a county of Tyrol existing in its own right, with larger parts taken away from the prince-bishops of this area. And from now on, we have one other crucial step in the history of Tyrol, and that is, as you see marked on the slide, the year 1369, when finally the possession of the county of Tyrol passes to the House of Habsburg, who include Tyrol into their territorial possessions and will rule Tyrol until 1918. So Tyrolean history, to a large part, is the history of the House of Habsburg. What makes Tyrol such a fascinating destination for art lovers is the fact that it has an almost unparalleled wealth of early medieval wall painting. That has much to do with the fact that for a long time, of course, through the Brenner Pass and the Reschen Pass, Tyrol was a major thoroughfare in Europe. There were influences coming in from all directions, but there were as well times where these mountain passes weren't used so much, and Tyrol, especially the more remote areas of Tyrol, got cut off from the main development, also artistic developments. So for these two reasons, we have first-class art, but we also have phases where this art was preserved until today. And when we look into slide 3, I want to start with an outstanding example of early medieval wall painting in the little village of Naturns in Val Venosta, west of Merano, traveling towards Switzerland. The tiny church of Saint Proculus has a rare survival of frescoes, difficult to date, but nevertheless extremely fascinating for its simple and rather abstract way of depicting the human figure, the human face. The church is dated through archaeological evidence towards the mid of the 7th century. Now, recent research has brought to light that the fresco layer we see today, and as you see examples here, most famously the man on the swing or the swinging man, and from the opposite side a group of figures, a group of men and women looking at the scene. This layer of frescoes has no stucco beneath it. That means it is the first layer of decoration on a wall of a church that is dated into the mid of the 7th century. So if we do not want to believe that this church stood without decoration for a century, we must assume that these frescoes we see today might date to the late 7th, maybe early 8th century. This is outstanding when we look into the remains of fresco painting in Europe altogether. The story we see depicted here with the man on the swing is referring to Saint Proculus, who is said, well, it's a local saint from Verona, who is said to have fled by night, abseiling over the city fortification. It is not quite clear if this is the scene we see here, as it looks more like sitting on a swing rather than abseiling from a city wall, although the building on top of it could point to some sort of building anyway. And then we have this group of people who look at that scene, bystanders, and when you look into their faces, it is amazing how simple and schematic these faces are, and with how simple the means are, with moving pupils towards the corner of the eye or towards the nose, little wavy lines on the forehead that give suspicion or surprise. So it is like a children's drawing, but rather effective in its display of emotion and action. If we move on to the next slide, I have given 2 pages from an Irish manuscript, and by its date created circa 780, therefore later than assumedly later than our wall paintings, but in style very, very similar when you consider how drapery, how folds that seem to come from a rather thick fabric are in a dowy way draped around the body. It's very, very similar. And it is just one example to give an idea where influences could have come from for the painters of these frescoes in Naturns. And one is the insular Anglo-Saxon world that, of course, in this time is seriously engaged in the Christianization of Central Europe in a first wave of missionary monks that come. So even though we only have a book here that is later in date, or assumedly later in date than the frescoes, it could just well be that we see influences coming from the British Isles. Of course, on the other hand, comparisons to late antique wall paintings in Italy also give hints of traces of style that are subsumed here in these frescoes. If you travel from Naturns even further west into the direction of Switzerland, our next slide shows a church in Mals, not too far from the Swiss border, the Church of Saint Benedict. And here we are thoroughly in the 8th century, and again it is amazing in its array of surviving Carolingian art. When you look at the picture to the right, you see the view, the interior view towards the east end. You see 3 niches set within the thickness of the wall. If you compare this with the slide on the picture on the left-hand side, you don't see the niches protruding from the building, so they're set within the thickness of the wall. And you see fresco remains, and if you look clearly or precisely towards your round-headed niches, you can see, even in situ, stucco decorations, an architecture made from stucco, a framework that was framing these niches in the wall. And on the left top corner you see one of these stucco fragments, but we come back to that in a minute again. In the foreground you can also see, very much in a Lombard style, fragments of a former choir screen made from a wonderful white and sparkling marble that was just quarried a few miles down the road in a village called Las, where you still have marble production, marble quarrying today. And if we compare the style of these fragments with fragments we find in Pavia, for example, in the museums, or in Cividale in Friuli, we very much see the similarities in the abstract Lombard ornaments, giving us the ideas of the tree of life, of the 4 rivers of paradise, intertwining branches without a beginning and an end. So what we get here is a very good idea that during Charlemagne's time, when this church was very likely built, the Lombard traditions are still coming in to Tyrol from the south. But on the other side, when we try to find parallels to our stucco decoration, and we now have a look into our next slide that gives you another detail in the middle. When you look how they worked here, you see the fresco And there are these holes in the wall just around the fresco, and you have to imagine that your stucco parts cast and created on the wall, they were affixed with iron hooks or wooden nails towards the wall. And as you can maybe trace if you look clearly, precisely towards the stucco fragments, they were also colored. When you compare this with the Carolingian manuscript page I'm giving just below, you can have maybe a good idea on what originally framed these three niches in the east end, and we must imagine that the stucco work was colored. And we can compare that to Carolingian stucco fragments a long distance away from South Tyrol in Lower Saxony, in the Abbey of Corvey, where they have found not only the same technique but also fragments of figures that look pretty similar. So it is a fragmented survival, but it is well fixed within our idea or our knowledge of Carolingian art. In addition to the choir screen, the marble fragments, and the stucco decoration in the wall, we have fresco remains, and what stands out here is the man you see on that slide, who is not a clergyman or a saint, as you would maybe expect on the east end of a church, but we find a secular, a nobleman, clearly shown in the attire of Carolingian court dress. He is given in a peaceful way by the fact that he holds his sword with the sword belt wrapped around the sword itself, so he can't draw the sword, and that gives us the knowledge he is shown here in a peaceful manner. And he has a rather strange halo that is square. And square halos are given to people who at the time when they were depicted were still alive but had behaved in a particularly pious way that one could assume they might acquire sainthood, something like this. So what is generally thought is that who we see here might be a clergyman from Charlemagne's retinue, maybe on the way to conquer Lombardy or on the way back. As we know, he came through Val Venosta at that time, and who might, in the face of a war, founded a church in his memory as a pious deed to do. We do not know for sure, but it ranks high amongst the Carolingian artistic survivors, not only in Tyrol but in the center of Europe. We jump not only to the next slide but also in time towards the period around 1200 to a beautifully situated castle right at the crossroad of the Adige Valley and the Isaac Valley coming down from the Brenner Pass. The town you see in the distance is Bolzano, and this advantageously positioned castle was built by, again, a local comital family, the Counts of Eppan. The village of Eppan is just at the foot of the castle hill. And around 1200, the castle chapel you see in the small insert was built within the walls of the castle itself. Now, if you take a look on the next slide and into this castle chapel, again, one is overwhelmed with rich colors and an enormously well preserved, pristinely preserved in large parts, wall painting. And it's not only the rich pigments they used, but also the specific stylistic means that were used that point in a very specific direction, and that is the Byzantine world of art. Now, when you look at the time frame of this castle, we are just in between the third and, well, not in between, but after the third and the fourth crusade. The third in the 1190s, and then in 1204, the fourth crusade. And especially the fourth crusade and the fall of Constantinople in the fourth crusade caused many artists from the Byzantine world to move, to flee. A lot come to Italy. Of course, Byzantine art is broad. Smaller pieces of art, sumptuous art, books, icons, can easily travel. And of course, who else travels? Our people. We have a lot of knights from Tyrol, and that includes 2 generations of the Counts of Eppan who traveled to the Holy Land themselves. And in one case, we know for sure that this man traveled via Cyprus, and we must assume that he saw specific churches who were just at the time newly decorated. Now, I want to talk about the main apse, the central apse, and its decoration. And when you look on this picture, you can already make out there is a Madonna and Child and enthroned in the apse, and we have a group of wise and foolish virgins below. We are going to concentrate on our next slide on the depiction of the Madonna and Child. We have Hoch Eppan in the right hand bottom corner. You see the Virgin is giving frontally. She has a large Christ child. It has almost the size of maybe an 8-year-old child, reclining, lying on her lap, and you need to look really precisely towards the feet of the child, and you can see that the one foot is turned with the sole towards us, so we can see the bare feet sole of his one foot. That is an iconographical mean to give us Christ recumbent in his tomb, dead, with his not yet pierced foot pointing to the fact that it will be pierced by a nail on the cross, and his mother already knowing about the passion to come by the way how she has the reclining baby in her lap. She is given in a specific Byzantine way of depiction as a Theotokos, the god bearer, and this aspect is underlined by these 2 angels to her left and right, carrying globes in their veiled hands that point toward the omnipotence of God incarnated in this child. And all of this is very much a depiction we would find in a Byzantine church, but not in a Western church. There you would expect Christ Pantocrator in this very position. If we now try to search for inspiration, if you just turn to the left of Hoch Eppan, we go to Cyprus, to Lagodera, to a church that is just finished with its new decoration when the first Count of Eppan visits the Holy Land. And there we have the composition with the Madonna enthroned. Here the child is smaller, it is sitting upright, but the composition with the 2 angels at the side is what we get in Hoch Eppan. There's another church that is very close to what we get in South Tyrol, and we travel across the Adriatic Sea to Macedonia. Corbinovo, which is just the similar period, shows a similarly large child reclining on his mother's lap, the same position of the foot, something we also might see in the Cyprus depiction. It is just a way of giving us an idea where the inspiration for the depiction in Hocheppan was drawn from. And that is just one example. If we started to look into the depictions of the presentation in the temple or the nativity, we can continue to find Byzantine models for our depiction in South Tyrol. It is not quite clear if the second count of Eppan, who traveled to the Holy Land, if he might have brought an artist or artists to South Tyrol. There are hints towards that, but it is not quite clear. Or if he brought works of art which he used as a model. But it is a wonderful example to show how South Tyrol, not only this castle, but the whole area, is sitting on or in the crossroads of Europe, with influences coming from various directions and melting together. There are other churches where these Byzantine influences can be traced. From around 1200 and South Tyrol, we now jump quickly over the Brenner Pass into our next slide and to Innsbruck and the late 15th century. The 15th century is a century of change for Tyrol. Until then, the whole county was ruled from the castle of Tyrol, Tyrol Castle, and the town of Merano. But in the 15th century, salt and silver mines were discovered in the Inn Valley, and this will procure the future wealth of the county, and therefore the capital moves from Merano to Innsbruck, and which follows is the Tyrolean Mint that also follows from Merano, not to Innsbruck but to nearby Hall. The first ruler of Tyrol who leaves a decisive mark, art historically decisive mark, is Emperor Maximilian I, who takes over the rule of Tyrol in the late 15th century and takes over a building you see to the left-hand side, the so-called New Court, that had been created when the capital moved from Merano to Innsbruck by Maximilian's successors as Tyrolean rulers, two men with wonderful names, Count Frederick of the Empty Pocket and his son Count Sigismund, rich in coin. And what was added by Emperor Maximilian is what is probably the most famous building in Innsbruck today, and that is the Golden Roof. And it is nothing more, but also nothing less than this bay window with an open loggia all built up in one, which is sparkling in every direction because its roof is covered in 2,600 odd fire-gilt tiles. And within that very small old town of Innsbruck, when we look at the position of the original city gates, the Golden Roof could be seen from every position you entered the city. And that is exactly what this is about. It is a building that takes part in Maximilian's concept of representation. Now, you see in the lower area an armorial frieze. There are coat of arms that give us the positions of Maximilian, and Maximilian is the one who forges the later Habsburg world empire through a very clever system of marrying, not only he himself, but then his son Philip and eventually even his grandchildren. And so he is proud of his possessions, and this is shown within these coat of arms. At the balustrade of the balcony, a floor above, there are again reliefs shown, which I give at least in parts here on that slide. You see to the left-hand side 2 dancers, Moorish dancers in grotesque distortions, and you see 2 other figurative reliefs. The one in the middle gives us Emperor Maximilian to the left, with his 2 wives, the first wife, Mary of Burgundy, through whom he acquires the possession of the Duchy of Burgundy, and then after her early death, his second wife, Bianca Maria Sforza. And then there is another relief that gives the emperor in the center with a court jester and likely a court official, assuming by his cap and dress. So what we see is a sequence of Moorish dancers, and they were awarded a prize, the one with the wildest movements, the most grotesque distortions. This person was rewarded a prize. And when we look into the relief of the emperor with his 2 wives, we see that Maria in the center, Mary, she holds a round object, very likely a golden apple, and she's the judicator, and she presents the prize to the winner of the mummers dance. And that leads us directly to what the emperor used his balcony for, and that is, if we move towards our next slide, we have a distant view of the golden roof on the right hand side, a wide street leading up towards the golden roof, and that was in fact all through the medieval and early modern history of Innsbruck, the only large square or largish square the city had altogether, and it was used for the staging of festive courtly enactments. And by the time of Maximilian, around 1500, the full set of courtly festivities, all the aspects that belonged to it, had been fully developed. That means we have to imagine Emperor Maximilian and his closest associates, his wife and counselors maybe, standing up on that balcony. And along the road you see, leading up towards the golden roof, you have to imagine a triumphal entry of knights dressed up in armor, and in a ceremonial cavalcade they enter that square, which will be the space of a later tournament. Then a tournament takes place on that square, and the whole event is finished with mummers dances and fireworks, and also masquerades as we see them in the reliefs of the golden roof. Emperor Maximilian isn't called the last knight without any reason. He loved medieval knightly chivalric entertainment, and although tournaments had lost their military purposes, they had become events, very exclusive events of princely sports and entertainment, and they were a mean of promoting one's image in courtly life to a great extent. And Emperor Maximilian promoted not only the invention of new tournament forms, but he also took great effort in developing the suits of armor you needed to pursue these specific jousts. And the picture to the left is one of 256 beautifully illuminated miniatures from a book called Freidal, an allegorical narrative Maximilian commissioned, where his own alter ego, Freidal, takes part in a series of tournaments against various opponents. And the reason he takes part in all of these tournaments is that he wants to prove himself worthy of marrying a princess. And this princess in this autobiography almost in this case, is a fictionalized version of his wife Mary of Burgundy. And today it is the best record of 15th and 16th century tournaments. We know no other source that give us so precisely the armor and the whole course of events as they would have taken place outside the Golden Roof in Innsbruck. While we see the so-called German joust illustrated here, where you meant to whether throw your opponent off the horse or break his lance. When we move to our next slide, this is a wonderful example of armor that is actually kept in Ambras Castle, just outside Innsbruck. And since Maximilian wanted to have a lot of influence on the development of the suits of armor and wanted to become independent from imports and other places of production, he established court armorer's workshop just following the Burgundian model in 1504 in Innsbruck. And with Hans and Konrad Seusenhofer, two brothers, he found two court armorers who created for Maximilian exactly what he needed for the new forms of tournament he invented. And what you see here on the slide is armor for the German course, where with lances you were not meant to unhinge your opponent from the saddle, but you were meant to hit the shield that was fitted with a mechanism that when you hit the shield right, it would detach itself from the armor, and that gave the hint to who won that particular joust, as you can again see in a beautiful depiction from the Freidal. Now, when we move to our next slide, we must look into the second very, very important artwork Maximilian has given to us, and that is his tomb in the court church in Innsbruck. An empty tomb, unfortunately. It's a cenotaph. He has never been transferred to this place. He died in Wels. He was then transferred to Wiener Neustadt, south of Vienna, where he is buried because of his burial place not finished at the time. What you can see is a central massive tomb with the emperor kneeling on top of it, facing in a praying position facing east, and then to either side a huge alignment of bronze sculptures. Now, Maximilian's idea was that his tomb is not only a monument of his eternal memory, but it should become a monument of eternal commemoration to the glory of his own dynasty. It is more a political monument than it actually is a funerary monument, even more so as he isn't buried in it. And the idea was to create 100 smaller just about that size, smaller bronze statues of the saints of the House of Habsburg and its representatives, or relatives, I mean, sorry, to prove that no other dynasty has more saints within its own family, and for that reason it is right that the House of Habsburg is in its rule acknowledged by the church. Then there were plans to create 34 busts of antique emperors to give the continuity and legitimacy of imperial majesty to the House of Habsburg. And then there were plans for 40 over life-size bronze statues of Maximilian's forebears, which included, most amazingly, men like Caesar, King Arthur, the Germanic kings Theodoric and Clovis, and Charlemagne, and then we begin with family members of the House of Habsburg. But the idea is to give a family tree of the House of Habsburg that roots within imperial antique majesty and has a continuous line into the times of Maximilian. Now you can't see on this picture the busts of the emperors, the Roman emperors, because they are kept in Umbras Castle. Of those 100 statuettes of saints, only a fragment was produced, and they are kept in another place in this church. And of the planned 40 over life-size figures in bronze, 28 were created until 1548, when Maximilian's grandson, Emperor Ferdinand I, decided to finalize the production of these monuments. It was, when we come to our next slide, it was a major task at the time. One has to bear in mind that bronze sculptures of that size were only cast in Italy at that time, and it might not have helped that Maximilian in the first place commissioned a painter to create the first sculptures, and he designed them in a way that made it very, very difficult to cast them. This is one reason why the whole project didn't really get started all too well. After a while, Maximilian then, as you can see, commissioned work with the leading artists of the time. In this case, he had Albrecht Dürer design some of the figures, including Maximilian's forefather Albrecht IV of Habsburg, which is probably the one with the most extreme armor in one of those figures. It is enormously complicated to cast a figure like that with a swinging suit of armor like this. But he also had the Nuremberg Fischer workshop cast various of the sculptures for him, including King Arthur, and obviously the dynastic link of Maximilian to King Arthur is maybe a bit fragile, to be careful here. But when you consider Maximilian's love for chivalric virtues, for example, then of course King Arthur is a man in whose tradition, at least, he sees himself. And therefore, as I said, it is not so much a dynastic monument, it is more a political statement. Maximilian might have been inspired by what you see on our next slide, which is the tomb of one of his first wives' forebears, the tomb of Philip II, Philip the Bold of Burgundy, who was the first Duke of Burgundy, whose tomb today is kept in in Dijon. And you can see that the tomb slab itself rests on a Gothic architecture, Gothic arches. Underneath you see pairs of mourning people, pleurants or mourners, who align themselves around the tomb of the deceased, who lead the deceased into his afterlife. And this idea is what Maximilian takes up in the lineup of his massive bronze sculptures. It's the same idea that they are mourners of the emperor's death, and they sort of give him company on his way to the thereafter. The tomb in Innsbruck has exerted great influence on further funerary monuments in Tyrol, and when we return to Innsbruck with our next slide, the Church of St. James, originally the parish church of Innsbruck since the 20th century, in the rank of a cathedral, in the left side aisle, we find another bronze tomb by Archduke Maximilian III, who is ruler of Tyrol just at the turn from the 16th to the 17th century. And he creates this monument, or he has this monument created in bronze mainly by a man called Hubert Gerhard. Some of you might have come across this name in Augsburg and also in Munich, where this man began to work before he became the court sculptor of Maximilian III in Innsbruck. And he's a Fleming by origin, but what shapes him stylistically is his training in Gian Bologna's Florentine workshop. He's one of these artists who brings this new Florentine way of sculpture to Northern Europe. And he creates these four wound columns carrying a slab on which you have the kneeling Maximilian III on the left-hand side, and he's accompanied by another man in armor who, when we just move to the next slide, you see him a bit closer, who is Saint George. His dragon can't be seen, we just see pieces of him behind Maximilian, but Saint George is an important saint within the House of Habsburg, and it was an important saint for Maximilian III. It is interesting again, not only that we have Maximilian given in the same way as Maximilian I, the emperor, 100 years earlier, is given on top of his tomb, kneeling and in a prayer position, but there's also put a great deal of importance into the display of armor. And we see Maximilian III in contemporary harness, whereas the Saint George, almost given as an immortal, eternal figure, is given in a suit of armor that was created at the time of Maximilian I, 100 years earlier. So by the use of two different types of armor, there is a time difference given between the person who is buried underneath this tomb and his patron saint, George, who is accompanying him. And you can compare here with a suit of armor that actually belonged to Maximilian and is on display in Vienna today in a museum. Maximilian III, although he wanted to be buried in Innsbruck in the parish church nevertheless put a great deal of money and effort into refurbishing the original Tyrolean burial site, which is a Cistercian abbey just about 40 kilometers away from Innsbruck in Stams. And this is our last site we are looking at, and I'm sorry I have overjumped one slide that is meant to set Maximilian's tomb in a certain context, and that is the fact that we here have a baldachin structure resting on 4 spiral wound columns. And when we look at the date when Hubert Gerhard and his pupil Caspar Grass designed this, 1614 to 19, we are still a decade before the most famous baldachin carried on spiral columns is created, and that is Bernini's baldacchino in St. Peter's in Rome. That was only created from 1624 onwards. So the reason I show this is to point to the fact that in the center of the Alps, in Innsbruck, we find a artistic design that is so much leading into the future, that is so modern and avant-garde at the time, that even in the work of someone as great as Bernini, it only appears a decade later. And now we go to Stams, which is again, as so often in Tyrol, not only a beautiful site to visit, but it is beautifully situated. The scenery in South Tyrol with the Dolomites as a background and with the northern range sort of circling around Innsbruck on the northern side, and then the Inn Valley is just very, very picturesque and gives a great backdrop to something as grand as the Cistercian Abbey of Stams, that originally was founded in the 13th century, and then during the time of Maximilian III, just at the turn to the 17th century, suffered some destruction by a fire. And that is the reason why in 1607, at the initiative of Maximilian III, a rebuilding takes place. And then just about 70 years later, a second, not rebuilding, but a redesign will follow as well. Now, the first slide in Stams I'm showing to you is the high altar, which is an outstanding piece of art. It is 12 meters high. It is completely carved from wood. And when you look to the 2 pictures on the side, you see that there is Adam to the left and Eve to the right. And from them, the branches of this tree grow to form a huge tree that houses some 80 figures, 84 I think is this precisely, of saints and other figures from the genealogy of Christ, but also from the Cistercian order. And the idea, of course, is that the tree of knowledge, the tree of life in paradise, bears rich fruit ever since, after the fall of man, through the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And there is this weird belief that Christ's cross was made from the wood of the tree of life that becomes the tree of death with the fall of man, that through his sacrifice on this cross, mankind is redeemed, and the tree or the cross itself becomes the tree of life again, and that will then bear rich fruit as in the saints and members of the Cistercian order. It is an altar that is very much in the tradition of the wooden carved altar pieces of the Middle Ages, for which Tyrol again is a major center. And when you look into the first layer where you have 5 figures lined up beneath, next to each other, this is very much the scheme we will find in late Gothic altarpieces as well. Only further up we get a rather organic, relief-like, staggered appearance of smaller figures that feel like standing on a stage. Originally, one must imagine this blue veil behind it did not exist. It only was added in 1730, made from stucco. So the altar would have worked a lot with the light protruding into the church coming in from the east. And these figures must have felt like hovering within the branches. Quite an astonishing impression. The artist here, Bartholomew Steinle, comes from Bavaria. So many artists in this church came from Bavaria, which gives us a good idea that after for a long time influences rather came from the south or the southwest, and then there were influences from Salzburg area for some time. We always have a strong influx of artistic influence coming in from Bavaria neighboring in the north. Now, once this altar was finished, some 70 years later, the actual burial of the Tyrolean rulers that found their last resting place in this church was renewed. And the reason for it was that the late medieval monument that stood in the center of the church blocked the vision of the altar. So when you came in, you couldn't see the altar well, so they wanted to remove that monument. And therefore, as you see on our left-hand picture, they created a confessio-like underground burial place to which you descended via a staircase. And all that is rising on the nave level is the cross with St. John and the Virgin at either side. And again, even though here we look at wooden figures, gilded, the idea again is still the same as in Maximilian I's tomb in Innsbruck, with an alignment of figures which you walk past when you walk towards the altar. So even if we're here at the end of the 17th century, the tomb of Maximilian I in Innsbruck's court church still influences Tyrolean funerary monuments. And even though all of this might feel strange in a Cistercian church, where this order bans sculptures and images from its interior space, we still have to see one last slide of St. Bernard's Hall, which is the epitome of Tyrolean Baroque. As light and delicate as it is in the beginning of the 18th century, very much influenced by Bavarian Baroque with Wessobrunn stucco artists working here. And if one hears that this hall within an abbey was used for all sorts of festivities, from banquets to dances, one might feel awkward seeing this, but we always have to bear in mind it is the abbey closely attached to the Tyrolean rulers, and they come and visit. And by the 17th century, there is no individual Tyrolean line of the House of Habsburg any longer. The emperors from the House of Habsburg are also the rulers in Tyrol. So if the ruler of Tyrol visits Stams, it is an emperor who visits. And therefore, you need respectable quarters and the infrastructure for all sorts of festivities. The frescoes on the wall at least depict scenes from the life of Saint Bernard. We come to an end with Tyrolean art here. It is just a short glimpse of what this very, very rich country in the middle of the Alps offers in art. And I hope I could give you an interesting insight, and maybe you fancy a visit to this wonderful part of the world. Thank you.